Hey, it's Lou, and some wild shit is going down in Nicaragua. Anti-government demonstrations have been widespread and deadly. A few weeks ago, pro-government snipers fired on a protest organized by mothers whose children had already been killed in previous protests. In April, a journalist was fatally shot in the head while broadcasting on Facebook Live. These aren't isolated incidents. Over the past 2 months, some 110 demonstrators have been killed. Government buildings have been set on fire. Vandalism is widespread. The country's president, Daniel Ortega, was once a national hero, credited with toppling a dictator and standing up to the United States. But now he's facing a popular uprising for his autocratic behavior. The question is, will all this chaos and bloodshed restore Nicaragua's democracy? The future of Nicaragua is at stake, and the country's history, perhaps ironically, offers a guide to what might happen. In the 1930s, the United States installed a general to lead Nicaragua. FDR, the American president at the time, reportedly said, "He's a son of a bitch, but he's ours." For 44 years, this son of a bitch and his family, the Somozas, maintained political control, creating a dynasty of dictators. They were not generous leaders, prioritizing self-enrichment over economic development. They exiled political opponents and turned towards brutality and oppression. So, in the 1970s, a popular but very bloody uprising forces the Somozas out of power. This was led by a guerrilla group called the Sandinistas. One of the leaders of the Sandinistas was Daniel Ortega. He was in exile part of the time, and his brother was the more active commander, but Ortega became head of state when the Somoza dynasty was overthrown. Keep in mind, we're now in the 1980s and in the middle of the Cold War. Sandinistas were socialists aligned with the Soviet Union. The US was not happy about this. So they support opposition groups collectively called the Contras, who wage a civil war against the Sandinistas. Now we've got yet another really bloody decade in Nicaragua. Plus, Ortega screwed the economy. Inflation skyrocketed. Businesses wanted nothing to do with that socialist government. It was a bad scene. So Ortega gets voted out in 1990. But he's still politically ambitious. He keeps running unsuccessfully for his old job. All that failure produces a realization. If he wants to regain power, he's got to change. Socialism didn't work the first time around. A makeover is in order. Ortega reemerges with a modified ideology. This time he aligns with big business. He develops a cozy relationship with the Catholic Church, a very influential institution in Nicaragua. He even builds a healthy trade and anti-drug trafficking partnership with his old enemy, Uncle Sam. Capitalists, Christians, and Americans. Not exactly a threesome you'd associate with a former Soviet Union ally. Most of the hardcore Sandinistas, therefore, abandon Ortega. But importantly, he retains the Sandinista name and the brand of the political movement. Professor Benjamin Waddell, a Nicaraguan scholar, told me this ideological about-face isn't totally surprising. Ortega's convictions have always been a means to power. He's strategic. Professor Eric Bossinger, an expert in Latin American politics, told me something similar. Ideology just isn't a big factor for Ortega. So when he got voted out, he got cynical and pragmatic. It worked. He was reelected in 2006. Back in power, Ortega has one huge advantage: Venezuela. At the time, the oil-rich South American ally gives money directly to Ortega, who uses it on these social programs to help Nicaragua's poorest. He provided roofs, discounted healthcare, better public transportation, business loans. He literally distributes chickens, roosters, and pigs. He puts lights on the National Baseball Stadium, allowing for night games for the first time. Meanwhile, foreign investors start moving into the country, so business activity picks up. The economy is improving. And that gives Ortega cover to start eroding the checks and balances on his power. Professor Andres Feldman, a Latin American expert from the University of Illinois Chicago, told me that Ortega is very clever at being repressive and undemocratic in a way that didn't really draw much attention, especially outside of the country. He shrewdly bribed the right people and sort of subtly harassed opponents. He steadily consolidated power. And remember, his name still has this legendary quality, so older Nicaraguans especially feel connected to him and let him slide. The younger generation is more skeptical. Plus, Venezuela's fortunes have turned, and they don't have money to dole out anymore. Hence, Ortega can't buy support with chicken and roosters. He's vulnerable. Earlier this year, there was widespread outrage on college campuses when government inaction allowed a wildfire to spread. It's a particularly sore subject with Nicaraguans because Ortega's family has long been accused of exploiting the country's environment for their own enrichment. Then, in April, Ortega's government announced there would be changes to Social Security benefits. Citizens would have to pay more to get less. Not a good combination, especially in Central America's poorest country. People started protesting, and this is where things got out of hand. Across the country, police fired live ammunition to break up the rallies. Meanwhile, pro-government mobs, these are violent civilian groups who Amnesty International accused of being Ortega's enforcement arm, also attacked the protesters. As the number of fatalities kept growing, images of senior citizens getting beaten and gassed go viral. In a country where young people often live with their grandparents, this is particularly intolerable. Plus, the vice president, she's the president's wife, so there's also that element of nepotism, called the protesters bloodsuckers, criminals, and vampires. This rhetoric does not help the situation. More marches, more demonstrations. Little old ladies stick their garden hoses through their fences to fill the water bottles of student protesters, a sign that generations are united. It's not even about Social Security anymore. The government actually scrapped those changes. Now it's about getting Ortega out of office. It's about getting democracy back to Nicaragua. In late May, mothers whose children were slain in the recent protests hold a march. This too draws violence. A sniper perched on top of the baseball stadium killed more civilians. The government claims they aren't responsible for that violence, but few people believe them. This whole tragic situation is playing out in some sort of funhouse mirror, where Nicaraguan history is repeating itself, but the old heroes are now the villains. The revolutionaries are now the oppressive ruling party. Massinger and Feldman both told me that Ortega has all but become Somoza. He has embodied all those same authoritarian instincts, including dynasty creation. After all, his wife is the vice president, and his kids are in key roles. Like Somoza, he silenced dissent and blocked the free press. But Ortega should probably know better than anyone how this ends. Not well for the strongman. And while he's shown no signs of stepping down yet, his support from the business community and the church has all but disappeared. And he doesn't have the same access to money to keep all those opportunists and yes men he surrounded himself with loyal. So perhaps all that pressure from the streets is working. And the sweet irony is, the people who are protesting, who are trying to bring Ortega down, they are borrowing tactics and slogans from the Sandinista movement he spearheaded all those years ago. The language is the same: free fatherland or death. They're carrying around placards of killed protesters, just like the Sandinistas did. They're rallying around the death of a journalist, that guy killed on Facebook Live I mentioned before. Something very similar happened in the 1970s. The funny part about that is, when Ortega and the Sandinistas came to power, they made their revolutionary exploits a part of the educational curriculum. Little did they know, they were potentially teaching the next generation how to push them out of power.